He slapped me between the sink and the coffee maker like I was drywall. One sharp crack that tasted like metal and 20 more that sounded like nails going into my own kitchen. I didn't raise a hand. I counted. When the last one landed, my wedding mug, blue handle, chipped lip, slid off the counter and broke into 3 clean pieces on the linoleum. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. It was Tuesday, August 12th, 2025, a muggy Dayton evening, 8:17 p.m. by the stove clock. My son Evan, 34, stood close enough that I could smell drywall dust and cheap cologne. His wife, Camilla, leaned in the doorway with her arms folded, eyes sharp with approval. That cut deeper than the slap. She wanted to see me small, and he wanted to prove he could make me so. I need 10 grand. Dad, you're sitting on it. His voice was loud, performative, like he was playing to her. I'm not a bank, I told him. And the last time was the last time. He grabbed the ledger I kept by the fridge and slapped it across the table. It fell open on the page I had underlined in red, 2019, $120,000 promissory note, my down payment for his house. His signature, mine, the Miller family trust as holder until the debt was cleared. Those papers were for the bank, he sneered. Paper theater, I met his eyes, then read the theater carefully. It's binding. The second slap rattled my jaw. Camilla smirked. And for the first time in my life, I realized my own son didn't just disrespect me. He wanted me humiliated. When they left, I set the broken mug handle beside the ledger, almost like proof on a scale. The landline light blinked red. My answering machine had caught everything. My voice saying, "Evan, stop." The clatter, the breath, 20 slaps like nails in a coffin. I pressed save. My neighbor, Nurse Eloise, crossed the street minutes later, flashlight in hand. She took 2 photos of the bruise on my cheek and made me hold an index card with the time written on it. If you don't use them, fine. But proof tomorrow is weaker than proof today. Inside, I slid the photos in with the HOA demand letter, $200 unpaid, and underlined the red $38,460 Evan already owed me in arrears. I placed the trust binder on the table where my mug used to sit. I didn't pray for my son to change. I prayed for my pen to stay steady. Proof isn't loud. It just lasts. I woke on August 13th at 5:42 a.m., the hum of the fridge sounding like a reminder that everything in the house was steady except me. In the bathroom mirror, a mustard-colored bruise was blooming across my cheekbone. I pressed my fingers to it and wondered which hurt more, the 20 slaps or the fact my own son wanted an audience while he gave them. I took my late wife's apron from the hook by the stove. She passed in 2021 and I hadn't moved it since. I folded it neatly and set it on top of the trust binder I'd left out the night before, like I was covering a wound. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my old spiral ledger. There it was in red, $38,460 owed. Missed payments, interest, the repairs I paid for when that burst pipe wrecked his basement back in March. I had kept every receipt, stapled by month, hole punched into the binder. My pension was steady but not endless. Every dollar I spent patching Evan's mistakes was $1 less for the life I'd worked 50 years to afford. On the fridge, the HOA's demand letter was still pinned under a magnet shaped like a guitar. When 2 outstanding dues. He'd ignored it just like he ignored my reminders. I thought about how the debt wasn't just money, it was dignity, chipped away like paint. I called my brother Hank at 7:15. Hank spent 30 years in the sheriff's department, and his voice still had that clipped patience of a man who has seen too much. I told him what happened. He let a long silence hang before saying, "Don't swing, file." Then he said it again, slower. "Don't swing, file." That same morning, I stepped outside and Nurse Eloise waved from her driveway. She came over, camera still in her hand, and asked if I'd slept. I told her the truth, I hadn't. She nodded and said, "Bruises fade, but dates don't. Make sure you write it down." She jotted her own note as a witness, signed it and folded it into my pocket. That evening, I couldn't sit still. I drove to Evan's place on Summit Street, parking down the block. Through the lit window, I saw him holding his little boy, my grandson, bouncing him high into the air while Camilla laughed. It was a picture-perfect family scene. But it cut deep because just hours earlier, that same man had left my kitchen with the sound of his hand still echoing on my skin. I cried in the truck, not for the slap itself, but for the man I raised and the man he decided to become. On August 15th, I sat across from Attorney Rhodes in his cramped office above a pawn shop on Salem Avenue. He wore a tie that looked older than me, and he had the calm eyes of someone who lived in paper more than people. I slid the trust binder across his desk. He opened it carefully, scanning the 2019 promissory note, the recorded mortgage, and my ledger. "You kept every receipt?" he asked. "Every one," I said. He smiled faintly. "Then you don't need to shout. You need to climb." That's when it sank in. I wasn't just a humiliated old man. I was a lender, a trustee, and my son wasn't just a bully. He was a borrower who had defaulted on obligations I could prove. When I left Rhodes's office, the Dayton air felt different. It wasn't cool or forgiving, but it carried something I hadn't felt since before Evan's hand hit my face. Resolve. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preparing an accounting, and this time the numbers would slap louder than he ever could. I didn't plan revenge. I planned accounting. By September 10th, the bruise on my cheek had faded, but the bruise on my pride hadn't. I sat at the kitchen table with Attorney Rhodes's email open on my old laptop. He had attached the arrears calculation, 38,460, down to the dime. The figure looked almost clinical in black and white, but to me, it was every late-night phone call, every "I'll pay you next month, Dad," every shrug when I mentioned the HOA letter. Numbers don't lie, but people do. On September 12th, I walked to the post office with Hank at my side. We sent 3 certified letters with green cards tucked into the envelopes. One to Evan and Camilla at their Summit Street address, one to his P.O. box, and one to his worksite on Hart Street. Notices of default. My name signed steady across each one. Hank watched me press the envelopes into the clerk's hand. Then he said, "That's the sound of a line being drawn." That same week, I filed for a civil protective order. Not because I wanted Evan locked away, but because I needed a paper wall between us. The bruise photos, Eloise's signed note, and the voicemail recording were attached to my affidavit. The clerk stamped case number 25CV4817 at the top, and I felt something click into place. On September 18th, I drove to Dayton Title and Trust and met Ms. Klein. She had the quiet precision of a librarian, every paper aligned, every pen capped. I slid the Miller family trust binder across her desk. She flipped through, stopping at the trustee clause. "With proper notice and a default recorded, you have authority to schedule a trustee's sale," she said. "But you'll need 3 weeks of published notice." She tapped the page lightly. "It's boring work, but boring wins." I liked the sound of that, boring wins. Still, I needed proof of Evan's cash skims to seal every seam. I hired Rufus King, a PI who once tracked down a stolen backhoe for Hank's department. Nothing fancy, just public records, cameras, receipts. By September 22nd, Rufus delivered photos of Evan pocketing cash draws from subcontractors at a duplex project. One shot had the date and time glowing from a neon beer sign across the street. 09/20/25, 8:16 p.m., cash in hand, smirk on his face. Proof again that he could pay everyone but me. That night, I opened my hallway safe and changed the code. I wrote the new numbers in my ledger margin. Lock code updated 0920. Hank made me log it, date it, and initial it like evidence in a case file. He knew how easy it was to lose track when emotions ran hot. The next morning, September 21st, I sat in church with my wife's photo tucked inside my Bible. I whispered, "Guide my hand to the pen, not the fist." When the pastor spoke about patience, I thought of the 3-week publication rule Ms. Klein had mentioned. 3 weeks of waiting, 3 weeks of building a wall so tall, not even my son's arrogance could climb over it. On September 25th, I walked up Evan's driveway and taped the notice of default to his door. Hank stood nearby, his arms crossed, making sure no one tried to tear it down. I took a photo of the posting, timestamped by my phone, and slid it into Rhodes's trial binder behind tab C. Camilla peeked from the window but didn't open the door. Her eyes flicked over the paper like it was a language she couldn't read. I turned, walked down the driveway, and didn't look back. For the first time in weeks, I felt taller. The judge set our hearing date for November 4th, 9 a.m., courtroom 3B. A line on the calendar, sharp as a blade. I didn't want to break my son. I wanted to balance my books, and I was learning that in Dayton, Ohio, in the fall of 2025, balancing books was louder than any slap. He ignored my letters. The law didn't. By September 25th, the notice of default was stamped, filed, and taped on his door. It wasn't a threat, it was the beginning of a clock ticking. I knew Evan would scoff, but paper has patience. It sits, it waits, and then it strikes louder than any fist. On October 1st, I paid the $312 publication fee at the Dayton Daily News. 3 weeks of trustee sale notices would run in the classifieds, right alongside ads for used cars and estate auctions. Nothing glamorous, just the steady, boring march of process. I kept the receipt, folded it into my ledger, and underlined the date. 10/01/25. Evan texted me that night, "You wouldn't dare, old man. You'll regret this." I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the text to Rhodes, who slid it into the trial binder under tab D. Every word he sent was another nail in his own coffin. The HOA reached out on October 2nd. Their email timestamped 2:03 p.m. They confirmed they'd cooperate if their $200 lien was settled at closing. I printed the email, highlighted the figure, and added it to my stack. Ms. Klein, precise as ever, sent me a pre-closing checklist. She even scheduled a locksmith for October 30th just in case. She said it plainly, not until after notice is run. Then legally, you'll hold the keys. Meanwhile, Rufus kept delivering. On September 29th, he caught Evan pawning tools at a strip mall shop for $540 cash. The pawn slip glowed under the fluorescent lights in Rufus's photo. Evan wasn't broke. He was careless. And careless is easier to catch than cruel. On October 10th, the notice of trustee's sale was officially posted. Auction scheduled for October 28th at 10 a.m., Montgomery County Courthouse steps. Hank stood beside me as I taped the paper to Evan's door. I counted my breaths, 1, 2, 3, just like he used to count reps for me in the high school weight room. Camilla opened the door halfway, read the notice, then shut it again without a word. Her silence was the loudest sound on that street. That night, my landline voicemail blinked red. I pressed play. Evan's voice snarled through the static, "You're nothing without me. I'll bury you before you bury me." I pressed save. Proof, again. I sat down at the table and laid out the evidence like cards in a hand. The 2019 note, the arrears statement, the HOA letter, the pawnshop slip, his texts, the voicemail. Every piece lined up like dominoes waiting for the push. My ledger margin filled with fresh ink. 10/10/25. Sale notice posted. Court hearing set for 11:04. Eloise stopped by the next day with a casserole. She didn't mention the bruise anymore. She just said, "You look steadier." I told her the truth, I was. Not because Evan had changed, but because the paper was holding what my hands couldn't. On October 15th, Rhodes sent me a thick envelope of filings, copies of every notice, every affidavit, every stamped page. He tapped the stack when I met him at his office. "This isn't revenge," he said. "It's accounting." By October 20th, Camilla called me at 8:41 p.m. Her voice was tight. "He says you're bluffing, that this is all show. Read the paper on your door," I told her. Then I hung up. At night, I sometimes replayed the landline recording, not to relive it, but to remind myself what 20 slaps sounded like. Each one had counted. And now, every certified letter, every receipt, every dollar figure was a slap returned. Quiet, steady, lawful. October 28th was circled on my calendar in thick red pen. Courthouse steps at 10 sharp. I wasn't just ready for the sale. I was ready for the silence that would follow, when even Evan's voice couldn't argue with a hammer's fall. He brought muscle, I brought minutes. On October 28, 2025, the Montgomery County Courthouse steps looked ordinary. Lawyers carrying files, a couple fighting over parking, a bailiff sipping coffee. But at 9:55 a.m., I felt the weight of 7 weeks pressing into my chest. The trustee's sale notice had promised 10 sharp, and I'd learned to trust the clock more than my son's word. Evan arrived like it was a performance. He pulled up in his battered F-150 with 2 friends leaning against the hood, arms crossed, smirks already primed. He strutted across the concrete in a jacket too new to be his, calling out, "End of the line, old man. You think you can sell my house?" Hank stood beside me, hands in his pockets, his sheriff's posture still intact even in retirement. On my other side, Ms. Klein held a clipboard, hair pinned neat as always, eyes scanning the papers like a conductor before the first note. At 10 on the dot, the auctioneer, short man in a grey suit, voice steady, cleared his throat and read the notice of trustee's sale. "Opening bid equals arrears owed under the promissory note," he announced. $38,460. Silence. Then a man from the back, a local investor with a ball cap and a folded check in his hand, called out a higher number. Another bidder raised it. Evan looked around, waiting for me to step in, to rescue him the way I always had. I didn't move. $389,000, the bidder in the cap finally said. The gavel fell, sold. The sound wasn't loud, but to me it was louder than 20 slaps. My son's face drained of color, his smirk collapsing into panic. "You can't do this. This is illegal," he shouted, voice cracking. His friends shifted uncomfortably, suddenly less like muscle and more like boys watching a father scold a child. Miss Klein clicked her pen. "Sale confirmed," she said softly, handing me a copy. Hank checked his watch, then said, 10:02. "Right on time." Evan lunged toward me, but the bailiff stepped between us. "You touch him here," the bailiff said, low but firm, "and it's not civil anymore." Camilla had been standing behind Evan, silent. Now she stepped forward, eyes darting between the paper in the auctioneer's hand and my face. For the first time since that night in my kitchen, she looked uncertain. Not smug, not in control, just uncertain. By noon, Ms. Klein had us in the offices of Dayton Title and Trust. Escrow opened. Payoff statements requested. The HOA lien of $2,200 slotted for disbursement. County taxes cleared. The numbers lined up in columns, no different than grocery receipts, except these receipts carried the weight of a house. That evening, Evan's texts came in like gunfire. First, "You ruined me." Then, "You're not my father anymore." Then hours later, "Please, let's talk." I archived them all. Rhodes had told me once, never reply in anger. In fact, never reply at all. Every word from him is evidence. Every silence from you is strength. On October 30th at 8 a.m., the locksmith changed the locks on the Summit Street house. Hank supervised, body cam clipped to his shirt, just as he'd done on hundreds of property seizures in his career. He handed me the new keys when it was done. Cold medal, warm justice. That night Camilla called me. Her voice was quieter than before. "How could you do this?" she asked. I answered with the only truth that mattered. By certified mail. I hung up, not in anger, but in finality. I laid 3 checks out on my kitchen table. One to Montgomery County for taxes, one to the HOA for their dues, and one made out to myself, $120,000 principal, plus accrued interest. My pen didn't shake. My wife's photo watched from its frame, steady as if she'd been holding her breath until this moment. The judge's clock confirmed. November 4th, 9 a.m. Courtroom 3B, that was the final note on my calendar. The sale was done, but the real showdown was just ahead. I sharpened a pencil and slid it into the trial binder. Not a weapon, not a tool of anger. Just something to write with when the gavel fell. He thought the court was a stage. The judge thought it was a scale. November 4th, 2025. Courtroom 3B smelled of old carpet and tired wood polish. The pew benches creaked as people shifted, waiting for their own cases. To most, I was just another name on the docket. But to me, this room was the edge where 20 slaps would finally meet 20 pieces of proof. I walked in with Rhodes at my side, his trial binder under his arm. Hank sat 2 rows behind me, arms folded, posture unshakable. Eloise was there too, crisp in her nurse's uniform, her photos and signed note tucked into a folder. Even Miss Klein had come, papers neat and orderly in a manila envelope. My allies weren't loud. They were steady. Evan entered late, just before 9. He wore a blazer too new, shoes that still smelled like the store. His hair slicked back like he thought this was a performance. Camilla trailed behind him, her rings clinking together as she twisted her hands. When his eyes met mine, he smirked, like he believed humiliation in private was one thing, but here in public, he could spin the story his way. The bailiff called the case, Miller versus Miller. Petition for civil protective order, motion for declaratory relief. The judge, a grey-haired woman with a voice like gravel, adjusted her glasses. Proceed, Rhodes stood, calm as ever. Your Honor, this is not about vengeance. It's about boundaries and debt. He slid the promissory note from 2019 onto the evidence table. The numbers looked as sharp as they had the day I signed it. $120,000 loan, secured by the Miller Family Trust. He laid down the recorded mortgage next. Then the arrears calculation, 38,460 past due. Then the certified letters, each with a green card signed by Evan himself. The judge looked over the green cards. Mr. Miller, did you receive these notices? Evan shifted in his seat, trying for swagger. I don't remember signing anything. My dad's old. He's confused, Rhodes nodded once. He gestured to the bailiff, who handed the cards to the bench. The judge leaned forward, squinting. Initials EM dated September 12th, September 25th, and October 10th. That's you, isn't it? Evan's jaw tightened. He muttered, looks like it. Then Rhodes called Eloise. She took the stand, her voice gentle but unwavering. She described the bruise, the timestamp photos, the index card she made me hold. It was August 13th, 2025, 8:24 p.m., she said, clear as glass. I documented it because he was afraid no one would believe him. She handed the judge the photos. Silence filled the courtroom. Rhodes offered the voicemail recording but didn't play it. The tape exists, he said, but we don't need to re-traumatize the petitioner. It's available for the record. The judge nodded. Understood. Evan's attorney stood, a young man with slick hair. Your Honor, this is a family squabble. My client may have lost his temper, but the sale of his home, the judge cut him off. Counselor, I've reviewed the filings. The trustee acted within his rights. The notices were published, recorded, and served. Your client signed the note. This is not a squabble. This is a debt and an assault. That's when Camilla stood. Her voice was small, but it carried. He hit his father. He promised me he'd pay it back. He lied to both of us. She didn't look at Evan. She looked at the judge. The gallery exhaled all at once. Even Rhodes blinked, surprised. Hank leaned forward, his jaw tight but proud. Evan turned on her, hissing, "Shut up, Camilla." The judge banged her gavel. Enough. Her eyes cut through the room like wire. Mr. Miller, you think this is theater? It is not. This is a scale. And on one side I have your father's bruises, his receipts, his certified letters, and his rights as trustee. On the other side, I have your denials. The scale is not balanced. She issued the order, a 1-year civil protection order in my favor, barring Evan from my home and contact. She affirmed the validity of the trustee's sale, denied Evan's request to undo it, and ordered him to pay $3,800 in my attorney's fees for frivolous filings. The gavel fell at 9:47 a.m. Just like that, 7 weeks of tension collapsed into 27 minutes of order. Evan slumped in his chair, eyes fixed on the floor. The same son who once towered over me in my kitchen now looked smaller than he ever had. Camilla sat back down, silent, her hands folded as if in prayer. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just wrote the date and time in my ledger. 11:04:25, protection granted. Sale upheld. As we left the courtroom, Hank clapped a hand on my shoulder. Paper beats fists, he said. I nodded, clutching the binder like a shield. The war wasn't about who shouted louder. It was about who could hold steady. And today, steadiness had won. A house sold once. Her son sold me twice. After the gavel fell, Evan didn't walk out of that courtroom like a man. He stormed out like a boy whose toy had been taken, fists balled, muttering curses that bounced uselessly off the marble walls. I didn't chase him. I didn't even look back. I walked steady, trial binder under my arm, Hank beside me like a guardrail. That afternoon, Evan took his tantrum public. Facebook lit up with his post. My father stole my house. Betrayal at 67 years old. He uploaded an old photo of me, holding my grandson, my arm around him, smile wide. He captioned it, "This man ruined my family." Within minutes, relatives from out of town were messaging me. "What's going on? Is this true?" I didn't reply. Silence can be louder than any defense. Rhodes advised me, "Let the filings speak. Don't step into the mud." On November 12th, Ms. Klein closed escrow. The wires hit in neat precision. Sale proceeds $389,000. Hoedus Kala 200 satisfied. County taxes cleared. Attorney's fees allocated. My final deposit slip showed $163,180 net to my account. Numbers don't lie, and that number was mine. I drove to Fifth Third Bank, slid the deposit across the counter, and watched the teller stamp it. I asked for a paper receipt and folded it twice, slipping it into my ledger. That was louder than any accusation on social media. Camilla left Evan 3 days later. Word traveled through Eloise, who had overheard Camilla moving boxes into her mother's house in Kettering. The sight of her carrying their toddler on her hip, suitcase in the other hand, wasn't something I cheered at. It was something I grieved. Family doesn't shatter clean like glass. It splinters, and the edges cut everyone who touches them. That night, Evan texted me at 11:12 p.m. "You ended me." I stared at the screen, then typed back slowly, "No, the note ended when you did." The next morning, Rufus sent me a final affidavit. Photos of Evan pocketing cash drawers, dates stamped, locations noted. It wasn't just about me anymore, it showed a pattern. Rhodes filed it with the declaratory case in case Evan tried to appeal. I slipped Rufus's invoice into my ledger and paid him in cash, $1,000 with a handshake. He said, "Most fathers cave. You didn't." Hank installed a new ring floodlight on my porch, receipts stapled to the manual for my binder. "If he tries something stupid, you'll have video," he said. Proof layered on proof. On November 15th, I mailed Camilla a cashier's check for $2,500. The memo line read, "For child's winter coat." I enclosed a note in my wife's old stationery, "Not a gift." A promise I made to his grandmother. I wasn't rescuing her. I was protecting a child who hadn't asked to be born into this mess. That night, I sat in my recliner, ledger on my lap, my wife's framed photo beside me. For the first time since August 12th, I slept through the night. No red voicemail light blinking, no texts from Evan rattling the table, no visions of his hand coming down like a hammer. Just quiet. I woke the next morning, brewed coffee, and wrote in my ledger, 11/12/25, escrow closed. $163,780 deposited, boundaries intact. My son had tried to measure me in slaps. I measured him in receipts, and in the end, the receipts were heavier. Justice didn't feel like thunder. It felt like a ledger balancing. 2 weeks after the sale, on November 26th, I stood once again in courtroom 3B. This time, the air was lighter, as if even the walls knew the fight was almost finished. Rhodes leaned toward me before the judge entered and said, "Today is housekeeping. The house is already gone. We're just cleaning the corners." The declaratory judgment hearing took less than 20 minutes. Rhodes presented the closing packet from Ms. Klein, escrow distribution, receipts stamped, taxes paid, HOA cleared, $163,180 wired into my account. The documents were so tidy, they looked like schoolwork graded A+. Evan's attorney tried to argue duress, claimed I had manipulated my son with complex trust language. The judge, without even looking up from the papers, said, "Counselor, your client signed a promissory note in 2019. He initialed every notice. The court will not rescue him from his own obligations." She affirmed the sale, upheld my trustee actions, and dismissed Evan's attempt to unwind it. Then she added a line that caught me off guard. Mr. Evan Miller will pay $3,800 in petitioner's attorney fees for frivolous filings. She tapped her gavel once. Crisp, final. Rhodes turned to me and whispered, "That's more than justice. That's punctuation." Outside the courthouse, the wind chased dry leaves across 3rd Street. I shook Rhodes' hand and slid an envelope into his palm, $5,000 and a handwritten thank you. He looked surprised. "This is more than my fees," he said. "It's interest," I told him. "Paid on time." Back home, I packed up the trial binder. Every document had done its work. I labeled 2 banker's boxes, one marked Trust, Archive, the other Evan Boundaries. Into the second, I slipped the Ring camera SD card, the voicemail recording, and the pawn shop slip. Then I taped the lid shut and scrawled in black marker, "Do not reopen without counsel." Eloise stopped by with a sweet potato pie. She hugged me once, checked my blood pressure with her cuff right there in the living room, and said softly, "You look lighter." I told her the truth. I was. Justice hadn't arrived with fireworks. It had come with paper, ink, and quiet signatures. On December 3rd, I attended a senior advocacy workshop at the community center. The topic was documenting elder abuse. I sat in the back listening as the instructor explained certified mail, affidavits, and photo timestamps. Everything they were teaching, I had already lived. I raised my hand once, added a small detail about keeping copies off-site. The room nodded. I realized then justice wasn't just for me. It could be a lesson for others. That night I checked my email. A message from Evan. No subject line, just one sentence. "If I apologize, can I move back into the trust?" I stared at it for a long while, then forwarded it to Rhodes. After a pause, I typed one line back, "Pay your debts. Earn your keys." Then I logged it in my ledger, 11/26/25. Judgment affirmed. Justice rendered. I closed the book, slid it onto the shelf, and sat quietly in the kitchen, where it all began. The hum of the refrigerator was still steady. This time, it didn't sound like a witness to humiliation. It sounded like proof that life goes on. I didn't raise a monster. I raised a boy who never met a boundary that stayed. By December 10th, the Ohio sky had turned gray and snow freckled the mailbox. I stood at the kitchen counter, where Evan had once struck me, and traced the scar in the linoleum where my mug had shattered. The bruise on my cheek had long faded, but the memory of humiliation hadn't. What changed was how I carried it. I sat at the table with my ledger open. For once, the columns read clear, paid, closed, balanced. I had steady hands, a pension intact, a framed photo of my wife on the shelf above me, and silence where chaos used to live. For years, I'd believed that being a good father meant being a safety net. But a net can strangle if you never cut it loose. On December 15th, I went to church. The pew was cold under me, but familiar. The pastor's sermon was about forgiveness. "Forgiveness is not forgetting," he said. "It's controlling the door to your own peace." I didn't open that door yet, but for the first time I oiled the hinges. That night, I wrote a letter to my grandson. I sealed it in an envelope marked "Open on your 18th birthday." Inside, I wrote, "A man counts what he owes before he counts what he wants. Don't let anyone teach you different, not even your father." I tucked it into the Trust archive box, knowing one day he would read not just words, but a lived truth. I also began volunteering at the community tool library. My first day, a boy about 15 walked in, struggling with an extension cord he had wound into a hopeless knot. I showed him how to loop it properly, how one coil feeds the next. His face lit up with the kind of pride only comes from learning something useful. My father taught me that same skill when I was his age. Passing it down felt like justice, too. On December 20th, I finally took down the copy of the notice of sale, still taped to my fridge. I slid it into the Evan Boundaries box and sealed the flap with heavy tape. On the lid in thick black letters, I added, "Do not reopen without counsel." I wasn't just archiving papers. He was archiving pain. That evening, I sat with Eloise over coffee. She asked, "Do you miss him?" I thought about it. I didn't miss the man who slapped me. I missed the boy who used to beg me to lift him on my shoulders at Reds games. The boy who once handed me a Father's Day card with "Hero" scrawled in crooked letters. I told her, I miss who he was supposed to be. Eloise nodded, eyes soft. Sometimes justice isn't fixing someone else. It's fixing yourself. I went home and held the broken mug pieces from August 12th, the ones I'd kept in a drawer. I washed them, dried them, and set them in a small box. Not because I wanted to relive the pain, but because I wanted to remember that things can break and still be cleaned, still be put away with dignity. As I turned off the kitchen light, I whispered to the empty house, "You didn't lose me. Evan, you gave me away." For the first time, it didn't sound bitter. It sounded true. You can win in public and still lose in private. By December 22nd, holiday lights blinked along the houses on my street, but mine stayed dark. I wasn't in the mood for decoration. Camilla texted me a photo that morning. My grandson in a puffy blue winter coat, cheeks flushed red against the cold. Just 3 words underneath, "Thank you, coat." That was enough. I didn't text back. Instead, I sent a holiday card with no return message, just my signature. Some lines don't need to be blurred again. Christmas Eve, Hank invited me over for ham and cards. His dog begged at the table, and we laughed at reruns on the old TV. For a moment, it felt normal, like before August 12th, but I could still feel the absence, a sun-shaped hole at the table. Hank noticed, because brothers always do. He topped off my coffee and said, "Sometimes blood's just another word for paperwork." He was right. That night, I came home to a voicemail on my landline. Evan. But he didn't speak, just breathing. The same kind of breath I heard between slaps that night in my kitchen. I saved the message, not as evidence, but as a reminder. Some silences weigh more than words. On December 29th, Ms. Klein mailed me the official closing packet. The final closing disclosure listed every number clean, $389,000 sale. $200 HOA paid, $3,800 legal fees awarded, $163,780 net deposited. I placed the packet in the trust archive box, the last piece of this chapter. By January 5th, I updated my will. Rhodes sat across from me, flipping through each clause. I changed one thing. Any future help to Evan would go through a spendthrift trust. Conditions attached, treatment, restitution, time. No direct gifts, no blank checks. If he wanted anything, he'd have to earn it by meeting those conditions. Rhodes slid the signed copy back to me. "Boundaries on paper," he said. "The only kind that stick." A week later, I drove past the Summit Street house. It was painted a fresh color, the porch light glowing, a new family's Christmas wreath still hanging on the door. I didn't slow down. I didn't roll down the window. I didn't say goodbye to the house. I said goodbye to the version of me that once believed love meant paying forever. At home, I took the broken mug pieces one last time from the box I kept them in. I placed them in a mason jar, labeled it August 12th, 2025, and set it on the top shelf in my garage. Not in the kitchen, not in the living room. Out of sight, but not erased. Proof that I had survived something meant to break me. That night, Eloise stopped by with leftover cookies. She looked around at my undecorated house and said, "You know, sometimes quiet is a gift too." She was right. For the first time, I let the house stay undecorated without guilt. Quiet was my gift that year. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and flipped open my ledger to the last page. With a steady hand, I wrote 12/29/25, case closed, trust intact, boundaries permanent. Then I closed the ledger, slid it onto the shelf beside my wife's photo, and whispered, "Merry Christmas, darling." I did it. He taught me something when he slapped me. Count. On January 31st, 2026, I stood at the Dayton Community Center, facing a room of 12 seniors, 3 yellow pads, and 1 dented coffee urn sputtering in the corner. The workshop flyer had read "Paper Trails for Peace of Mind." I was the guest speaker. Not because I asked, but because Eloise had suggested it to the director. I held up a certified mail green card and said, "This little piece of paper is louder than any shout, louder than any threat, because it sticks." A woman in the front row nodded hard, clutching her purse tighter. A man with a cane raised his hand and said, "My son borrows my bank card, never pays me back." I don't know what to do. We sat together after class, side by side at a folding table. I showed him how to start a ledger, how to list amounts, dates, receipts. He looked at me like I was handing him armor. Maybe I was. I left him my pen. Walking out into the pale winter light, I felt something I hadn't in months. Useful, not just to myself, but to someone who needed to know they weren't powerless. That's the irony of all this. I thought Evan had taken something from me, but in truth, he'd pushed me to remember the systems I'd built my whole life. Systems that protect you when love fails. At home that evening, I brewed tea and sat in the kitchen where the 20 slaps had landed. The hum of the fridge was the same, but the air felt different, lighter. The broken mug pieces rested in their jar on a shelf in the garage, out of sight but not forgotten. My wife's photo sat steady in its frame, as if she'd been keeping count too. I wrote my final entry in the ledger, Zo13126, boundaries taught. Justice complete. I closed it, slid it into the trust archive box, and sealed the lid with tape. That night, I replayed the words that had been sitting in me since August. You didn't lose me, you gave me away. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't bitter, it was truth. Evan may never understand that love without boundaries is just debt dressed up as devotion. He may never understand that when you teach someone they can take without paying, you're not saving them, you're setting them up to fail. And maybe he'll never learn. But I had. Justice didn't arrive with fists or fury. It arrived with receipts, signatures, affidavits, and dates written in steady ink. Justice was a ledger balanced, and the final irony? My son thought he'd humiliate me with 20 slaps. Instead, he handed me 20 reasons to prove the law was on my side. He gave me a story, and in telling it I gave myself back my dignity. I turned off the kitchen light and walked to bed, whispering into the quiet house. Proof isn't loud, it just lasts.